Thank you so much for joining us. Now, after sacking President Robert Mugabe as leader of the party, of Zimbabwe's ruling party, what does this mean for other leaders in Africa who have stayed, who've held on in power for so long?
Well, I do think that this is going to send the shockwaves right across the continent for the presidents who have perpetuated themselves and reproduced themselves beyond the period of welcome. But at the same time, it may also raise issues where you do have any effort to raise the issue of family dynasty as part of extension of legacy. And not only that, one thing that the leaders may also notice is that when they do have a grip of the party and they have many people who seem to support them, that normally collapses once the balance of forces change, because some of the people are simply loyal because of the patronage networks and the fear for their lives. But when it comes to the reality, they might have long been frustrated by the leaders, but not being able to stand up against them. When the opportunity came, then they would move for it.
Now, Professor, Mugabe is known to be militant. He will not go down without a fight. And he may not be ZANU-PF president now, but he is technically still the president of Zimbabwe. And constitutionally, he still has the necessary carte blanche to hold on to the presidency. So what options does he have at this point to hold on to the seat?
Very little, really, because if your majority party, which has a majority in parliament, is going to move for your impeachment and the removal as the president on Tuesday, as it is reported. And if the army, which has the monopoly of violence in many instances, has moved against you, those are two levers of power that you necessarily have. Those removed, you are left with nothing. In fact, this has been one very smart coup in a sense, because the army tilted the balance, created the space for all those who had been suppressed politically, including those within the ZANU-PF itself, and allowed for what would be a constitutional process to reverse the gains or to reverse Mugabe's grip on power. Of course, he is quite militant, he may be defiant, but they may deny him, one, the opportunity to have a free access to the media and the public. Or they might actually indicate to him that if he wanted a dignified exit, he has tomorrow to decide. And if he wants to have an indignity of having to go through an impeachment, then he goes through what is a fait accompli process of Tuesday of being removed by Parliament.
Now, opposition leaders have called for the formation of an inclusive transitional government. And I guess, Professor, the focus now is on Joyce Mujuru and Morgan Tsvangirai. But then little has been heard from them as the crisis intensified over the past few days. So what have you heard so far, and do they risk being sidelined by the army?
Well, I do think that they did mention that they would want to have a government of national unity and a unity government. But the question will be, where does ZANU-PF will have within its heart to extend their hand for such an arrangement? But even if ZANU-PF holds on to power by itself, they may create forums where they say there is a need for a cross-section of the society to actually build Zimbabwe again from the ruins in terms of the economic ruins, social and political ruins. So to that extent, you may have their involvement in one form or another. And in an extreme form, they might be invited back to the party.
You reckon the military takeover has been constitutional?
The military takeover technically has been constitutional because they never removed the government from its seat. In a sense, they simply exercised their power to say the national interests are under threat. They said the president is safe. He was allowed to go to a graduation. So to that extent, they never dissolved cabinet. They never imposed martial law. They never removed the president. All what they did was to create a space for a protected public sentiment of mass demonstrations against Mugabe. They created a space for the ruling party to do the job. And if they go through parliament, technically, you will not have had a coup in a textbook sense.
Well, ZANU-PF and arguably a majority of all Zimbabweans are now united in rallying behind Emmerson Mnangagwa, and he's been hailed as a messiah and a liberator for all Zimbabweans. But then, Professor, let's not forget that Emmerson Mnangagwa has been President Robert Mugabe's key ally and a personal friend for time immemorial. He was also implicated in the massacre in the Matabeleland massacre, wherein over 20,000 Zimbabweans died, and he was behind the repression and the oppression of opposition parties in the successive elections between 2000 and the year 2008. I mean, one does get a sense that he certainly is a carbon copy of President Robert Mugabe. So are we likely to see President Mugabe's rule, but in a different form?
I doubt really. There seems to be a groundswell calling for some kind of change. Indeed, there is nothing removing the fact that Mnangagwa has a checkered history himself. But at the same time, he may read the mood on the ground that if you want to reconstruct Zimbabwe and therefore have an appeal to the public, which is rising openly, he may have to do things differently because he may not want a massive repression at this particular stage because of the international and the national sentiment that you see. He may want to build goodwill. He may want to hide behind saying many things that we were made to do, we were directed by our leader. So he has one chance. Others are quite skeptical. Remember that he was also the one who assisted in the sidelining of Joyce Mujuru. So they'll have to do a lot of reconciliation behind the scenes.
Now, Professor, early this morning we woke up to reports that China and the United States actually knew about the coup in Zimbabwe, and shortly after his dismissal as the vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, well, even though these are reports that are unconfirmed, that he fled to China in fear of his safety, and he told President Mugabe that he will come back and lead the people of Zimbabwe. This is what is happening already, as we see in the past few hours. So this does give credence to these reports that China actually knew about this coup, doesn't it?
Remember that the army general who came back and announced and denounced what had happened was in China on an official visit at the time. Indeed, China has invested heavily on Zimbabwe, and it has massive debts which Zimbabwe still have to pay, or the loans which were given to Zimbabwe. So to that extent, China would not be an uninterested party. Whether Mnangagwa might have gone there physically or not, it would actually be prudent to think that China and other interested countries may have been interfacing with the security organs and with some of the political leaders behind the scenes. In any event, at an advanced age of 93 years, most countries which are strategic partners do have scenario planning behind the scenes to say, if he goes, what would happen, who is likely to rise, and they start the courtship with that person.
Now, having held on to power for 37 long years, what could have possibly gone wrong here, Professor? I mean, Robert Mugabe, we know he's a very strong person, he's a fighter, he's militant, but then he lost friends, personal friends, in the person of Emmerson Mnangagwa. He lost support from the Youth League, he lost support from the army at the drop of a hat. What could have possibly gone wrong?
The first one is not judging the mood. When you start saying you will stand as a candidate when you are 94 years, already that tells you that something has gone fundamentally wrong. You can't separate the country, the party from yourself, because there is a time when you have to step off. And most of the time, Mugabe would spend sleeping in the meetings, sleeping in the official functions, and sometimes falling and staggering. So that in itself, I think the national interest of Zimbabwe might have been imperiled just by sheer age factor and degeneration. The second one, the wife's ambition, that is Grace Mugabe, drove Mugabe in all kinds of directions, which I think triggered his sudden fall. Because Grace Mugabe wanted to be deputy president and the president of the country by all means. And she was cutting corners. She was alienating Mugabe from some of his comrades. And she was also building a base from people who do not have the liberation, credentials and roots. So to that extent, when Mnangagwa was expelled and others were expelled, when Joyce Mujuru was expelled, when Mujuru's husband was mysteriously burnt to death in his house only last year, all those signaled purging of some of the ZANU-PF people, and the army might have been working for some time behind the scenes on some changes, and they might have lost any hope for the December conference of ZANU-PF when some of the key people they thought would rise and challenge Mugabe or challenge Grace Mugabe were still in place. And also they might have realized that ZANU-PF would be doomed if a 94-year-old candidate contests elections and campaign for elections.
Now, getting information from out of Zimbabwe at this very critical point in that country has been quite a challenge for the media and all journalists alike. But then the information or the unconfirmed reports were to the effect that the ZANU-PF is actually negotiating a dignified exit for President Robert Mugabe. And I presume that means that he will be free of all litigation or prosecution against him. But then would that be the case then, Professor, given the fact that he's got no support whatsoever within government and within the ZANU-PF?
I do think that the army has been quite clear, and I think many of the ZANU leaders are quite clear that they wouldn't want to humiliate Mugabe. But if pushed to a corner where he refused to step aside, despite the popular will, despite the military steps, and despite being rejected by his party, then they will be forced to go down that lane, which could be an ignoble exit for Mugabe. But at the same time, if you are that age, sometimes it would be very difficult to advise a 93-year-old person who has only known rulership for the last 5 decades or so in the party and as the leader of the country. So to that extent, it's just an open gamble as to what he might do or how he may react. But everyone else, I don't think they want to humiliate him. But he may decide to challenge them at his own peril.
So should he decide to resign, what do you think will happen to him moving forward?
I think they may even allow him. He's a very proud Zimbabwean who doesn't want to leave the country. They may even allow him a safe space within the Zimbabwean, scene, but without appearing in public and uttering statements. And they may also allow him to have extended, leave of absence, whether for medical reasons or other reasons. But I doubt he will actually cohabitate with Mnangagwa quite easily, given the last 2 years of a broken relationship.
So should power be transferred from the hands of Robert Mugabe to Emmerson Mnangagwa, are we likely to see Zimbabwe being the breadbasket of Africa again?
Zimbabwe will take some time, but just positive sentiment alone will bring back your investors, will bring back many Zimbabweans who have gone into the diaspora. And that in itself could be a turning point. And if it is well managed politically and Mnangagwa extend his hands to even political opponents and there is greater freedom, then you are likely to have a turnaround of Zimbabwe. But a country which has been in a ruinous state for the last 10, 15 years may take another 5 years of a conscious, concerted effort to begin to see the benefits and the turnaround.
So in case of attracting investors. Investors will meet the new transitional government with quite a bit of skepticism because they know that old habits will die hard. What do you think the strategies that will be employed by this new transitional government to appease the investors? Do you think the involvement of the opposition movement in that government of national unity perhaps will help appease the government? In particular, having involved Morgan Tsvangirai, because it's been widely seen as a puppet of the West or somebody who the West endears him.
Well, I do think that an extension of a hand to the leaders of the civil society, to the trade union movement, to the opposition parties, even if they may not necessarily be in government, creating space for them might be enough to create positive energy and collaboration. And also trying to consciously invite the Zimbabweans in the diaspora. This is an educated elite in the main, and some of them are well-to-do business people who could go back and invest in the country, who could help mobilize resources and give assurances. Of course, in some instances, they may have to revisit some of the policies without abandoning the transformation and the indigenization tone, but they may ease up things and try to create space for the investors.
Professor, this is certainly a turning point for Zimbabwean politics, and thank you so much for helping us unpack this as it unfolds. So that was Professor Somadoda Fikeni speaking to us live on the line from Pretoria.